All right. My name is Robert Lee Swofford. I was born on a side hill cotton farm in western North Carolina. When I was 7 years old, my father moved in his Model T truck to Minnesota. So in early 1941, in February of 1941, our reserves and National Guards were activated for supposedly a 2-year training program. And so I went with the National Guard driving the truck to Louisiana. And after spending a year down there in training, we went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, where after a few days, there was a bulletin on the board saying that the Air Corps in those days had changed their requirements for pilot training from a 2 years college, which I didn't have, to a high school plus a IQ type exam. And a bunch of us went down to take the exam that night, and 3 of us passed. So I became an Air Force cadet. And so after classifications, I was selected to be the pilot training rather than they selected the groups. They separated the groups between navigators and bombardiers and pilots. What the criteria they used, I don't really know. Maybe the pilot couldn't really be outstanding in the other 2 fields, so they gave him the job. But anyway, I went through flight training, and I first flew the biplane, the Stearman, and had a young fellow as an instructor, and it was interesting because up to that point I had never been within a mile of an airplane until I climbed in the back seat of this trainer.
And how old were you then, sorry?
Huh?
At this time, how old were you?
I was just 18 and nearly 19 at this point. And so then we went to basic, which is a single engine training, and then a primary was a single engine, a little bigger horsepower, 650 horsepower, and a real airplane. And I had a very interesting instructor. He was an English pilot officer, and there was nothing that you could do in any airplane that we didn't do. And my first time I ever did a barrel roll, which is a corkscrew-like thing through the air, was in a 4-plane formation, and I loved it. I mean, we were either blacked out at 10,000 feet chasing each other around, or we were down between the pine trees 10 feet off the ground, and I thought that was great fun. But so then when I graduated, I expected to get a fighter to go ahead and do fighter training. Well, when I got to my assigned base, it was a B-25, and I checked out in the 25, flew that for about 3 months. Then I was sent to a B-17 school. I checked out there, and then my next assignment was to a B-24, and I completed 24 and got a crew and picked up an airplane at Lincoln, Nebraska, and they told me to take it to West Palm Beach, Florida. And from there I went through to England by way of South America and Africa. And after we arrived in England, we were into a kind of a pool of people. We didn't go directly to a squadron, but we were there for a week or so, something like that. And then I was assigned to the 445th Bomb Group at Tivenham, just about 15 miles south of Norwich. And we walked into this big room, and we were standing around wondering what next to happen. And a nice-looking young man came, not old, well, man, he's older than I was considerably, but Major Fleming, and he asked me if I'd be in his squadron. So that's how it came. 700 squadron, the 445th Bomb Group. And I moved into a Quonset hut with another captain, first pilot, named Clymer, who later on got shot down. But he was a very interesting person. He was one of the original group that came over, and he was a promoter, and he had arranged for a local farmer for his wife to do our cleaning, and also traded for eggs, and so we often had fresh eggs in our Quonset hut. But he also made a deal with a local cider mill that produced hard cider, and about every 2 weeks he'd deliver a 3-gallon keg of hard cider in the weeds behind the Quonset hut, and which leads to another problem later on. But my first mission was I went as co-pilot for Kleinman, and then the first pilots would take one trip with someone else, and then they could take their own crew. So, but it was to Brunswick, I think, and the only thing notable about it was that that was the first time I had been up there, and we climbed up through a cloud deck, and I was appalled and amazed at the number of airplanes. Just not single airplanes, but swarms of them. Everywhere you look were swarms of airplanes. And then you'd see them moving around, and they'd get in line. It took about 2 hours, really, for the whole 8th Air Force to get organized in formations and get in line, and then leave England. So we had individual homing beacons that we had assembled into 36 airplane formations. And then we'd leave that at a given time to go to another beacon to fall in line with the whole 8th Air Force. You had a time like a clock. You had to be there. And that's the way, and then we'd depart England for Germany, usually straight east across the North Sea, or once in a while we'd go to France or sometimes northern Germany. And most times we were at altitudes before we left. And there was a few times if you were going to northern Germany or south, you might climb en route, but mostly we were at altitude. And it was cold. Oh, Jesus, it was cold. Our free air temperature in the cockpit would read to 65 below. That's Fahrenheit. And I've seen the needle sitting on a peg. So it was cold. But we were well equipped with heated suits and sheepskin outfit. The gloves we had were a silk glove, and then the heated glove, and then on top of that a 3-finger gauntlet of sheepskin. And it may seem rather clumsy, but it was adequate for flying the airplane. And so on my 4th mission, that's the first time I got into any kind of trouble, because we were bombing some suburb of Berlin, and just after the bomb dropped, the formation made a couple turns, which threw me out. I was not good enough to stay in position, so I was lagging behind, and 4 109s attacked us. And the first pass, they hit us with 2 20-millimeter shells, one in the middle of the center of the tail turret, which the shock and all that shoved the gunner back inside the airplane. And he said afterwards why he just thought he was dead, but he felt around, arms and legs were all okay, so he climbed back into the turret again. But it had blown the glass and everything out the back, and he lost elevation of his guns, but the turret would still turn. So when the airplanes came back again, he shot at them, even though he knew he couldn't hit them, but he thought maybe the muzzle flashes would give him something to think about. But the first pass, there was 1 shell in the turret, and 1 right behind the number 3 or right inboard engine. And that engine quit instantly, and I feathered it. And then the other engine ran for about a minute before it quit. It just died off. I think what had happened is that it had cut the throttle cable, and I think went back to zero thrust, so I had to feather that. Well, I was 600 miles from England on 2 engines on one side, and there are some authors, Stephen Ambrose, who writes about B-24s. He had the opinion that the airplane wouldn't fly. Well, it did, but it wouldn't fly very well. But of course the formation left me and I was by myself, and we put maximum power on the other 2 engines, and whatever I got out of it. So the airplane was settling. I just had to maintain its speed, and finally it started to hold its altitude at 3,500 feet. And then I had the decisions of what to do. I thought about going to Sweden, which wasn't terribly far away. I could go to Switzerland, or I could go do, I don't know what else. So I decided to, rather than do anything different, I'd just take the regular route home, thinking that I might have fighter protection along with me, or some other airplanes. And I did catch up. We were 3,500 feet, and we were just on top of a cloud layer, which gave us some protection. But later on, it was clear below us, and you felt awfully naked. You were so close to be, you just felt like anybody will see us and come up and finish the job. But we were keeping track of our fuel. I had the engineer transfer all the fuel from the right side of the airplane to the left side, and so we'd have as much as possible in the tanks. And but we kept track of the fuel consumption, even though we were pulling maximum power. And so I had to make a decision when I got to the coast over the Zuider Zee. We computed finally that we had enough fuel to cross the 120 miles of the North Sea in February, which is an unlivable option of going into the water. But we figured out we had enough for 8 minutes. We could get across the 120 miles and have 8 minutes of fuel. And so when the navigator said we were over the coast, well, there was still the cloud deck below us. So I pushed it down through the clouds and broke out at about 700 feet above an airport. And I circled the airport. And then I made a serious mistake. Instead of just putting it on the ground, the airplane had been flying. I hated to destroy it. So I tried to crank the gear down. And that took me about 2 miles. And then I was about a mile from touchdown, with the gear only partially down, and the other engine quit. So I was down to 1. So there's no option except landing. So I pushed it down through some treetops into a little wheat field. And we were sliding through the mud in this wheat field, and there was a ditch across the field, and we went across the ditch, which then the nose dug in. But I was aiming for a tree on the farther side of the field because I thought that would help stop us so that we wouldn't run into the hedgerows, which are just like concrete. It worked out fine, and they hit the tree and broke the wing off. But I started to scramble out as quickly as I could. I noticed the co-pilot had left a couple switches on, and I reached over and turned those off, and I went through the upper hatch. I looked out, and my whole crew was about 50 yards away, standing at the butts. They said, "We're all here." Some of them were routine. There were many times when you'd fly a whole mission, you wouldn't see a fighter. Then other again, or an aircraft. Sometimes an aircraft fire was accurate and close to you. It would explode, and the fuselage would rattle. Not from shrapnel, actually, just from the pressure. And you'd think, "Oh my God, I got a million holes in it." But we didn't. We had we had flak suits, a little vest type thing, and we in the cockpit the vest didn't do you any good, so you take that off and put it underneath your seat cushion. But one day the armament officer came by and he said, I had to go raid your airplane. And I said, what's the problem? He said, we're running short of flak vests. And he said, we found about 25 in your airplane. I said, my gunners had been stealing them, and in the back they'd lay them down on the floor like a big mat and stand on that. So they took all our flak vests. I just laughed at the guys. I said, once before, when we first got there, they were supposed to be issued a metal helmet, like a artillery band or a service band, and the supply people wouldn't give them any. He said, we don't have any. So I said, well, I'll go see what I can do. So I went down, and in the tent I could see through a door a big pile of stuff that they had recovered from people who got shot down. I said, well, I think there's a helmet in there. So I walked down in, and he said, well, I can't give you that stuff. He said, I haven't recorded it yet. And I said, well, it don't matter. I went on and picked the helmets up. He gave them to the guys. I said, okay, the next time you need something, just get it. I said, don't worry about procedures, just get it. So that's why I ended up with 20 black suits in the airplane. I told the armament officer, well, I really thought the airplane was a little heavy on the controls, but the only other mission that I had any kind of a near miss as far as that we were going in on a target, and there was a 4-gun battery. It was working on a group ahead of us, and they knocked an airplane out of that sky. And then, as we came along, they fired at us, and the first 4 bursts was right out my window, about 150 feet or so out there. But they had our altitude dead, and the next shot was about 25 seconds later. He moved over half the distance to the formation, and I happened to be flying a left wing at this particular mission. So I told myself, well, the next shot's going to be right here, because they had our speed and everything cold. So I just slid it over there, about where the old bursts were. I just slid it over there and stopped, and then the next burst came. The airplane, that was about as far from me to that sign above me, just that's the position we flew. He got 2 hits. One was in the left wing that cut the wing in half, and another shell cut the fuselage about the windows, and then he flipped over and went out of my sight. But then the formation slid out, started on the bomb.